Welcoming, walking with, and waiting for. Dear friends, it's wonderful to be all together as a flock after an extremely blessed 9-day pilgrimage of sacred shrines in Italy with 35 of our parishioners and in spirit with so many of you as well. Today's gospel message assures us that Jesus is truly the one eternal good shepherd who lays down his life for us, his united flock. As his committed followers, each of us are called to lay down our lives as good shepherds who will welcome in, walk with, and wait for all whom we encounter on this, our earthly pilgrimage with one another. This means we are co-responsible for welcoming in, walking with, and waiting for one another as A, fellow Christians, B, fellow community members, C, fellow members of the same parish family, D, fellow members of St. Vincent Church, E, fellow members of many of our own families of origin, and F, members of the human race in general. Now, in connecting our roles as good shepherds who welcome in, walk with, and wait for each other, I'd like to begin by sharing some of the highlights of our recent pilgrimage, which began on the first day by visiting the Vatican to hear Pope Francis at St. Peter's Square. It was amazing to witness flocks from all over the world listening to our primary good shepherd here on earth, Pope Francis, teaching about the virtue of fortitude, which affirms our need to lay down our lives for one another, because love not only entails endearing and heartwarming moments together, but is just as much about enduring self-sacrifice for the good of each other. Moreover, the virtue of fortitude gives us courage to suffer out of love when welcoming in, walking with, and waiting for those who have been entrusted to our care. Now, from the Vatican, we visited St. John Lateran, which is the oldest of the basilicas in Rome. We went from there to the Lateran Palace, which was a home for many of the popes, which houses what are called the Holy Stairs. Has anyone ever heard of the Holy Stairs? The Holy Stairs are the very stairs that Jesus walked up in front of Pontius Pilate upon being judged and condemned to crucifixion in the Praetorium in Jerusalem. So in the 4th century, these stairs were transported to the Lateran Palace. And inadvertently, I didn't walk them all, but many people did. And the way to do that is to walk them on your knees. So I made it about 2 stairs, and I thought, I'll just stop and pray here. After that, we had our very first Mass together in Rome at St. Mary Major, which happens to be Pope Francis's personal favorite because it's dedicated to our Blessed Mother. And it's also the only basilica in Rome in its original structure. On our second day in the Eternal City of Rome, we visited the site where the Apostle Peter, under the very human fear of being crucified, briefly fled from the city walls of Rome. And as the story goes, he encountered the risen Christ, who looked him in the eyes and said, "Quo vadis?" "Where are you going, Peter?" Yes. Well, Peter turned around and went back into Rome and said, "I'm not worthy to be crucified like my Lord. Crucify me upside down." At the point outside the walls where Jesus and Peter met has now been memorialized as a chapel where we stopped on our way to the catacombs, which entail believe it or not, 5 underground levels of passageways that span over 20 kilometers underground, intended for the burial of over 500,000 Christian bodies in the ancient days of the church. We celebrated Mass in their chapel, which, by the way, those catacombs aren't for the claustrophobic. After Mass, we visited the Basilica of St. Paul outside the wall, which is where the Emperor Constantine constructed a huge basilica in memory of the execution and burial site of St. Paul. From there, we visited St. Peter's Basilica and Michelangelo's Pietà, where it's just this beautiful statue of the Blessed Virgin Mary holding her son Jesus, who has just been crucified. We also visited burial sites of the popes, the Vatican Museum, inspiring relics, and the incredible Sistine Chapel with a famous mural of God the Father and Adam almost touching fingers, portrayed on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. On the third day, we celebrated Mass at St. Columban Chapel in St. Peter's Basilica, and then toured more of Rome, including the Piazza Novana, which was once built for athletic competitions and now famous for Baroque architecture, the Trevi Fountain, which, by the way, I tossed a coin in for each of you so you would get to go back there someday, and the Pantheon, the Roman Colosseum, and the Roman Forum. The following day, we drove to Assisi, where we said Mass at the Basilica of St. Mary of the Angels, which houses a very little, humble chapel where St. Francis of Assisi spent most of his days and died just outside of. From there, we went up the hilltop of Assisi with a breathtaking view and visited the Basilica of St. Clare, as well as another huge Basilica of St. Francis. The following day, we headed to the blue waters of the Adriatic Sea to celebrate Mass at the Great Marian Shrine of Loreto, which is where the Holy House of Nazareth can be found. The house that Mary lived in Nazareth has been transported to Loreto. We then journeyed to Lanciano. Has anyone ever heard of the miracle of Lanciano? If you have not, it is worth finding out more of. There's been all kinds of scientific testing, and this is where the first major Eucharistic miracle occurred in the 8th century. This was followed by our trip to San Giovanni Rotondo, where the following morning we celebrated Mass in the old church where St. Padre Pio received his stigmata, wounds of Christ in his hands and feet. From there, we visited the new church constructed in 2003 with resplendent mosaic tiles and murals and gilded ceilings of gold, where Padre Pio is now laid to rest. We then traveled to the beautiful Gargano Peninsula to this grotto of St. Michael of Archangel. Imagine a huge cave where there's been intercessions from St. Michael from several bishops who have asked for miracles to happen. Huge cave that's now a sanctuary of a church with a church built up on top of the cave. It's an incredible place. So from there, our last day, we drove through the Italian countryside and vineyards to a monastery on top of a mountain called Monte Cassino, founded by St. Benedict in 529, where we celebrated our final Mass for all of you before returning home on Wednesday from Rome. Now, with all of this in mind, including today's gospel message about the self-sacrifice of laying down our lives, not to mention Pope's teaching on fortitude, what can we say about welcoming in, walking with, and waiting for one another? 1. First, on being a good shepherd who welcomes others. After Monday morning, our first outbound flight from Seattle to Rome was delayed by about 5 hours. We eventually arrived in Rome late Tuesday afternoon after traveling through Chicago and Frankfurt for a day and a half. The first person to welcome us was our amazing tour guide, Carlo. In addition to his charming Italian accent, Carlo is probably the best tour guide in Italy. He was ever attentive to the personalized needs of our group, and not a single member did he fail to engage in with conversation. And in light of our Partners in the Gospel configuration with St. Teresa, we do well to learn from Carlo by asking if we avail ourselves to those whom we encounter on a daily basis. Are we especially welcoming to newcomers, to our country, our state, our city, our community, our parish, or our church? In response, let us strive to make a lasting impression of kindness with an opening for friendship toward those whom we encounter today. Secondly, on being a good shepherd who walks with others. During our pilgrimage, it came to pass that some of our beloved pilgrims could not walk as fast as others. In fact, in some cases, had difficulty walking at all. This provided an amazing opportunity for members of our group to simply check in and see how each other were doing in order to walk at one pace that was sustainable for everyone. This means we are called to meet one another where we are at. If someone in our midst does not see things the same way you or I do, there's no need to react. We can simply respond by shifting gears to do whatever is possible to make the connection that we have a heck of a lot more in common than we do different, especially with those we seem to have the most conflict with. A good shepherd will always walk at the pace of the sheep, never forcing them from behind or running too far ahead. Likewise, we might ask if our conversations with loved ones, with coworkers, with friends, and acquaintances alike are similarly as patient in waiting for others to share their fears, to share their needs, and to share their hopes, while striving to be a community of believers concerned with caring for others. Third, on being a good shepherd who waits for others. This is sometimes the hardest. Several times on our pilgrimage, Deacon Juan and I found ourselves waiting for someone in our group to arrive in the lobby of the hotel, to board the bus, to join us at meals, and in some cases, I must confess, I might have been the one that was being waited for. The bottom line is that we're called to wait for those whom are entrusted to our care. This often means waiting for others to see things the way God wants us to see, while patiently persevering in love without expecting anything in return. In fact, this is essentially what ministry is all about: loving others without expecting anything in return. After all, as the consummate good shepherd, Jesus gives us all of himself without expecting anything in return. Likewise, we might also want to recall that the annual Catholic Appeal is now upon us as an important opportunity to lay down our lives, to welcome in, walk with, and wait for others in anticipating renewal of our archdiocese. As such, there are several ministries throughout the archdiocese that depend on the support we provide through the annual appeal. A few ministries in particular that we've recently established here at St. Vincent in relation to the annual appeal include young adult ministries and bereavement ministries. And if there are any two areas I often hear from parishioners about, it's one, a desire to welcome in, walk with, and wait for young adults to find that their fears, needs, and hopes can be answered by surrendering to Jesus and the church. And two, that none of us are immune to the grief that comes from loss. As a community of believers, we are called to shepherd one another by welcoming in, walking with, and waiting for those who are hurting, to find the healing hands of Jesus ever present through our heartfelt love for one another. Let us prepare ourselves now to welcome in, walk with, and wait for one another by finding the very fortitude that's veiled within the one and only sacred site and cornerstone of our pilgrimage to St. Vincent today, the Eucharistic miracle of Jesus' real presence, made known to us here and now by breaking open the Word of God, by breaking bread together, and by breaking away from any tendency that might keep us from welcoming, walking with, and waiting for each other today.